Hey y'all, I'm Jordan, and it's time for another Armstrong Antlers and Anglers fishing tip. Let's go get bit. There he is. Okay, so Doug's hooked us up with everything we need from the store, from our 7-pound Samurai fluorocarbon to our bait of the week, the Berkeley flat-nosed worm in both green pumpkin and smelt, our Gamma Getsu 2-aught drop shot hooks, our Ohio River Outdoors tungsten, and me, I guess. So let's dive right into this. We're going to cover the time of year we use this, what the water conditions are that we're looking for. We're going to talk about water depth. We're going to talk about retrieve. I'm even going to show you how I tie it up, hook it up. We're going to go into everything. This video is going to be a lot more in depth about how we use this bait to try to help you get more hookups in your boat this year. Let's talk about the time of year that I use this. For this bait here, I don't really look at water temps as much as I do time of year. Time of year and water clarity are the two big things for a drop shot to me. So time of year, I typically start using a drop shot right in the middle of the spawn. I will say that the type of drop shot I use in the spawn is a lot different than the drop shot I use in my spring, late spring and summer patterns. And I'll use it right up until the fall starts to cool down the water temps. Whenever you start seeing the lakes turn over and flip, whenever the water temps start to cool off, the leaves start to turn, that's when I quit using it. So to a degree, I use water temps, but for the most part, once I start using it, I'm not looking at water temps daily trying to figure out if this is still going to be something I use, right? So the two types I use, let's talk about the spawn pattern first, and then we'll go into the summer pattern, which is the longer pattern. The big difference is during the spawn, and I'll tell you why here in a second, I use a shorter leader length to my sinker. So in the spawn, right, your bass make beds. They plan on having eggs there. They're getting really protective. Whenever they start laying eggs, and you have both the buck and the female in there, especially the female because she's the one we really want, right? She's the bigger one. You can throw a jerkbait over top of it to try to get them to react. You can throw a jig in there. Your big thing in bed fishing is trying to get the fish to get angry enough to move your bait off of the bed and out of the bed. Whenever you see them flare up, that's whenever you set the hook, right? Well, a drop shot is perfect for that because it's able to agitate the bass more. With a drop shot, like this one I have rigged up here, as you can see, I have a really short leader to my tungsten sinker. A lot of times I'll use a bait that's a little bit chartreuse on to maybe try to mimic a bluegill, or I'll just go with straight green pumpkin. But you throw this into the fish's bed, like so. I don't know which camera you can see this on, but you throw this right into the fish's bed and let that hover right in front of that fish. It agitates them so much that they have to react, and it's a great bait that you can just throw in there and leave in there. You can, once you drag it in, I usually throw it a little bit outside of the fish's bed. I drag it in, I pull it up, and you can just watch it agitate the fish as it's trying to think about what it's going to do. And as soon as you see it flare up and touch your bait, set the hook, it's yours. I will say whenever it comes to bed fishing, I'll usually use a little bit heavier line because the fish aren't as frantic. This isn't as much of a finesse fishing tactic as it is a bed fishing tactic. So to reduce loss, I'll go up to 12-pound fluorocarbon for this. Now, whenever it comes to my summer pattern, I'm still using the same green pumpkin colors. I'm still using black and blue, still using the smelt color. The big difference whenever I move into the summer is going to be my leader length. So, excuse me. So, for those of you who have good electronics, who have live scope, stuff like that, I do adjust my leader length a lot to where I think I see the fish at in the water column, right? I try to be a little bit above them, especially for smallmouth, because smallmouth like to bite above. With my electronics, I typically try to adjust accordingly, right? But just like me 2 years ago, before I had the great electronics, you couldn't tell exactly where the fish were in the water column. I will tell you that this length right here, about 12 to 18 inches, works great all the time. Honestly, whenever you're fishing shallower, if you're fishing in, let's say, less than 5 foot of water, stick to a 12-inch leader. If you're fishing in more of a 10-foot water, go to an 18-inch leader. If you don't have the electronics, just adjust according to depth. It's not that big of a deal. You're still going to get the bites. But I think it does help a little bit whenever you have the electronics to get a few more of those pressured fish if you can get it right in their face. But that's not the end all. That's not exactly how you have to do it. 12 to 18-inch leader. So what's the difference between the spawning pattern and the summer pattern? It's pretty obvious. Whenever the spawn's over, you have a few more weeks before the water gets really hot into your spring where the fish are still biting really good on power fishing, crankbaits, buzzbaits, spinnerbaits, jigs. I don't go directly into the next method of drop shotting. What I do is whenever the bite starts to get harder or get tougher as the water temps start to warm up, whenever we really get into those dog days of summer, that's when I go to this bait. Or if I'm at Lake Erie, I will say at Lake Erie, everything I say does not apply. This bait is fire 100% of the time at Lake Erie, all the time. Anywhere else in the world that I go to, whenever you get into your dog days of summer, the water temps are well over 80 degrees at this point. The spawn has done, went, and passed, and those fish have moved into their summer pattern, which they're going to be there for a good long time now. That's when I'll put a drop shot in the rod locker on the deck of my boat. Typically, it's always on the deck of my boat, right beside of a wacky rig, a small swim jig, small chatterbait, because I still do like to try to finesse fish a little bit, some kind of popper or something like that. But 99% of the time, you're going to find this exact rig right here on the deck of my boat. So when the water temps get hot and we're past the mayfly hatch, spawns over, all that stuff. The shad spawn's over, which this can also work good in the shad spawn. This can also work good for just live scoping, but we're not talking about that right now. Whenever we get into the warmer water temps, it's summer's here to stay, that's when I pull this out. Watercolor, clearer water. Like I've said before, this is mostly a clear water tactic. The fish have to be able to see the bait. It's not making a lot of noise. It's not real aggressive. If the fish can't see it, they're really not going to come to it. I know some of these scented baits, like the flat-nosed worm, you might be able to draw some in, but honestly, if I get past a slight stain, I don't really know how to describe it. If I can't see this thing more than 6-7 inches in the water, I really don't throw it. So if you're in the summer, it's not raining a whole lot, you have clearer water. Where do I fish it at? I fish it everywhere. Everywhere except in heavy cover, because it obviously doesn't drag through heavy cover very well. But something like this right here, I look for current on the main lake or the main river. I look for a lot of current. I don't really worry so much about depth. Typically in the summer, I don't fish outside of the 10 depth range. So I look for current, I look for eddies, I look for rock breaks, and I look for rock. If you can find a lot of big chunk rock, that is great. If you can find a lot of submerged rock, that's even better. I try to fish this around rock, around transitions. Excuse me again. And even if you can find wood that you're not necessarily going to get hung up in, submerged wood, this works great. And you're going to lose a lot of your slip weights. But even around wood, this bait works absolutely amazing. Whenever I get into my summer pattern, though, that's when I switch to my lighter line, like the 7-pound Samurai fluorocarbon. I always use fluorocarbon. The reason why, again, this is a sight bait. This is a finesse tactic. The fish are looking at this longer. They're not biting it off of a reaction. So I want something that looks a lot more natural. So whenever you have a higher grade, lighter fluorocarbon, like what you see there, not only is this bait more nimble, not only is it giving more action in the current, but it's also a smaller diameter, so it's harder for the fish to see. It gives it a more natural look. It helps you bring it through the water column better. It helps you get more hookups. Just make sure you have somebody with a net. I will say, honestly, I have boat flipped so many 2.5, 3-pound smallmouth with 8-pound test, 7-pound test, 10-pound test. You can do it. The biggest thing I would say is if you're going to do it, make sure you retie every few fish, because after a while, this is going to start to get brittle. My retrieve, it varies, but I have two major retrieves that I go with whenever it comes to a drop shot. The first retrieve, let's say you're around a nice rock bank or you're on a point somewhere where you know there's fish. I'll throw it out to where I think the juice is, right? The best area. And I just let it sit there. I don't get in a hurry whenever it comes to fishing this bait. This isn't a bait that you're going to power fish. There is power shotting, I guess is what you would call it. I'll get into that here in a second. But for the most part, throw it out there and just let it sit. I usually start off with not giving it a whole lot of action. I don't sit there and flip the rod like this, especially if you're fishing in a lot of current. A lot of time that current's already given this bait, he knows it's just hanging there. It's already given this bait some sort of little slight action like that looks like a shad just suspended there in the water column. And you'll get a lot of baits doing that. I'm not going to say it's the most fun way to search for fish, but whenever you get on that bite, especially if you can get into a good school of them, man, is it a fun bite. Because once they're on, they're on. After that, I just slowly drag it to me. If I don't get any bites, I will start to do a slight action, but I don't get real aggressive with it. I do because what you think is a small hop in the water is 5 and 6 foot, actually. So when you're doing this, you're moving this a lot further than you think you are. But if I'm not getting bites, I will give it a slight action to the tip of my rod, right? And I bring it through what I consider the juice. I bring it through to where I think it's not really giving a good presentation anymore. I reel it back up and I throw it back out. The other way I like to use this time of year, live scoping. This is a great bait that you can run around with the live scope on. You can pan over, you can see the fish, you can throw this down to it, you can watch it go down, you can watch the fish engulf it, right? I guess the third big tactic would be powder shotting. So whenever you're powder shotting, the only difference is I upgrade my sinker weight. This here I think is a 3/16 ounce. I upgrade my sinker weight to something heavier like a 3/4 or something like that. That way it makes quick bottom contact and you can drag it to you really quick. So those are the 3 ways I do it outside of the spawn pattern. The final thing I really think that we need to go over with y'all, I'm going to clear up my workspace a little bit, is how I tie it up. So when I tie this up, I go with a polymer knot, and I go with tungsten weight like this that has a little slip on it. That way, you know, as you're pulling on it, it can just slide. If your sinker gets stuck, you're not going to be stuck retying, it'll slide right off. I usually start, you go down through, right, facing upward, like so. Right? Make sure you give yourself a lot of tail here. Okay? You're going to need it for your sinker later. So, pull through to get to this point right here. So now we get to this point where we have our hoop, we have our hook, and we have our tag end. So now we're going to take our hoop, spin it around. Now we're at this point right here. We have our tag end like this. We cinch it down a little bit. We bring our hook through the big hoop. Bring it back. Get it snagged a little bit on your skin. Then we're going to pull it through. And right about here, I wet my knot. So, there you go. There's that. Now, after I get that rigged up, I will take my tag end and I will run it back through my eyelet. Just like this. Right here. Pull it down. Sometimes it'll be a little difficult to get hold of. Pull it down. Right there. About like this. It's a little bit easier when there's water there helping to float. Going to your rod. There's your setup. So, I'm Jordan with the Getting Bit Fishing Team. Thanks for joining us here at Ohio River Outdoors today. Thanks to all of our great sponsors, Armstrong, Jan Dills, Ellenboro Floors, Wood Heating and Cooling, Seven Rivers Marina. Thank you all for everything you do for us. We appreciate it and have a great day. Hey y'all, it's that part in the show where we're going to take a break and you're going to join me and Jan Dill's attorney at law in saying thank you to the veterans who've made our freedom possible. This week, Jan Dills and myself would like to remember Corporal Jason Marchant, a Doddridge County, West Virginia native who lost his life during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2005 when an IED went off near his platoon, taking the life of him and one other service member out of his platoon. Jason, this salute is for you. Thank you for your service to our country. Hey y'all, it's Jordan, and today we're talking about how to put that next big bass in your boat this fall. Let's dive right into it. The topwater bite, is it going to be a spinnerbait bite? Is it going to be a swim bait bite? Is it going to be a crankbait, deep diving crankbait, jig, finesse? Who knows, right? Well, don't let fall get too complicated for you. For any of those of you that like to fish early spring when the water temps are still really cool, this should be really familiar territory to you guys. I know there are a few different, factors as far as the fall, like the fish aren't gearing up towards the spawn, stuff like that. But as those water temps cool, these fish are going to push up shallow, similar to what you see in the spring. So whenever it comes to the best bait for the fall, there's several different baits. Topwater, this is a great time of year for topwater. This is also a great time of year for deeper diving crankbaits. I don't really do a lot of finesse fishing in the fall. Don't get me wrong. I do if I need to, if the fish really aren't biting on anything more aggressive. But whenever it comes to catching your next big fish in the fall, don't be scared to throw those bigger, more aggressive baits this time of year. The fish are feeding heavier. They're getting ready for winter. They're getting, things are going to get colder. They know that. So the fish are going to be feeding up really soon. And this is the time to start using those more aggressive baits to try to get those larger fish. So what's my favorite baits in the fall? Honestly, when it comes to fall fishing, I really love to try to go after a topwater bite. I think it's one of the best times of year to go after an aggressive topwater bite, and a buzz bait is really my preferred method. I know that some people don't like how quick a buzz bait moves, and honestly, if I don't feel that the fish are that aggressive to be chasing a buzz bait, I do like a good popping bait or a whopper plopper where I can still get that noise and that action that you would get out of a buzz bait with a whopper plopper, but I can slow it down. I can pop it a little bit. I don't have to worry about it sinking. I can keep it in the strike zone longer. But if I'm covering water, one of my favorite ways to cover water and have fun is with a buzzbait. And when I'm throwing a buzzbait, I like a heavier rod. I like a 7'4" to a 7'6", medium heavy with a fast or moderate action tip. I typically throw it on monofilament, usually at least 15-pound test or more. And how I determine when I want to throw a buzzbait, it's honestly one of my starting baits that I go with. Like I said, when I'm covering water, when I'm trying to figure the fish out, a buzzbait's really a good starting bait. One of my second favorites, especially this time of year, is a square bill crankbait. With a square bill crankbait, again, you can cover a lot of water efficiently. It triggers those reaction bites. And this time of year, when the fish are feeding more aggressively, especially up shallow the way that they are, a square bill crankbait can be an absolute killer whenever it comes to catching not just a lot of fish, but big fish. Whenever I throw a square bill crankbait, I typically throw it on a 7' to a 7'4". Medium, I really don't go over a medium. I might go to a medium heavy depending on how big the crankbait is. Fast action tip, I throw it with a lighter pound line, as you have seen in some of my previous videos. Typically when I throw a square bill crankbait, I throw it on 8 or 10-pound test fluorocarbon. So when do I pick a square bill? Honestly, just like the buzzbait, it's one of the key baits that I use to search for bass this time of year. A square bill isn't only good year round, but this time of year is probably one of the first three baits that I'm going to throw. It'll probably be a buzzbait, a square bill, and then a swim jig or swim bait of some sort. As far as determining when or where I'm going to throw it, I really look for some of that murkier water. I look for a lot of cover that I can throw it through, somewhere where I can really make a lot of noise. 6 foot of water or less typically, or if I can find some grass that I can hit the tops of it with, it's in 10 foot of water. I really like to throw it around gravel. I really like to throw it around primary and secondary points. Square bills can be absolutely lethal, and they work, honestly, in my opinion, they work in their prime whenever they're near some sort of current, like in a primary or secondary point. And like I said, the third bait that I'm going to go to is a swim jig. This time of year, bass are typically feeding on shad or bait fish of some sort. A swim jig is just really universal. You can use it in so many different applications, so many different depths. If you don't like the color that you're using, it's really easy to change out the plastic trailer that you're using to adjust color or adjust size. There's just so many different reasons that I like to go with a swim jig this time of year. Whenever it comes to where I'm going to throw it at, like I said, it's going to be probably the third bait that I'm going to throw. It's going to be my third option. Especially if I get near deeper water, it's going to move up to more of one of my primary options because, as I've mentioned in previous videos, buzz baits don't really work well in anything over 10 foot of water. Square bills, obviously, if you get over 6 foot of water or however deep they're made to go, if they're not hitting bottom or hitting some sort of structure, square bills really aren't that effective. When it comes to how I like to set up my swim jigs, I really like a heavier rod for this. Still a 7 foot to a 7'4", but I always stay with a medium heavy or even a heavy moderate action tip. When it comes to the type of line that I like to use for a swim jig, again, I like 15 to 18 pound test fluorocarbon. I like to stick to a heavier line whenever I'm using the swim jig because you're going to come around a lot of cover. A lot of times when you're throwing a swim jig, you're throwing around brush piles, you're throwing around gravel, or you're throwing around grass. And with any kind of situation like that, with all the stuff that's going to be nicking and cutting on your line, especially if you're aiming for that next big bite, going with a stronger line never hurts. And with a moving bait, don't worry, those fish aren't going to see that line, especially when it comes to these reaction bites. I'm not going to argue that when it comes to finesse bites, that going to a lighter line doesn't help, but you're only going to be hurting yourself if you use a tactic like one of those three, chasing a big or a large bite, and you're using a smaller line, especially if you're fishing by yourself and you got to net that thing by yourself. You're really going to be in a world of hurt and you're really going to be upset whenever that thing breaks off. And we've all been there. I'm speaking to you from my own personal experience. I like to rig these baits up. Well, universally, with every bait that I just mentioned, I'm going to use a Palomar knot. Not just because of the technique I'm using, but because it's fluorocarbon line. Anytime that I'm using fluorocarbon, a polymer knot's almost the only go-to for me. I just think that you have less of a chance of breaking it. I know there's other connector knots like the FG knot and stuff like that, and I'm not going to argue that those don't work great. I use them personally as well, but whenever it comes tying directly to the bait itself, if you're using fluorocarbon, I promise you, doing a polymer knot is going to save you so much heartache in the end, especially if you're one of the people that like to do like the old twist knot. That's really not going to work with fluorocarbon. I'm not saying that some of the other knots aren't just as stable, but the polymer knot is my preferred whenever it comes to fluorocarbon. When it comes to rigging up my buzz bait, this is the kind of buzz bait that I like to use. As you can tell, I don't use a skirt. Most of the time when I'm throwing a buzz bait, I do throw it skirtless. And as you can tell, there's a couple modifications there that I've learned just over the course of time from watching different videos. I will say, if you notice how this is bent down here like this, if you take a pair of pliers to your buzz bait and kink it like that and put it this part down in the water more, you're going to save yourself a few heartaches and you're not going to have as many fish miss or not get a hold of the hook. When it comes to the kind of trailer I like to use, I just like to use these little Strike King grubs right here, and I just thread it up on the hook, put a little dab of super glue on it, and when it comes to the retrieve, it's typically just a straight cast and retrieve with a few sudden, pops or stops, stuff like that, a few erratic motions. But for the most part, I just try to go nice and slow as I can go, and keep the bait on top of the water with just a few subtle motions is the best way to throw a buzz bait. And like I said, make sure you put a little dab of super glue right there, or else you're going to waste a lot of money in these trailers, and you're going to get really frustrated throughout the day as they keep trying to pull off as you're casting. When it comes to swim jigs, again, this can be one of the absolute best and most universal baits that you can have in your tackle box, not only year-round, but in the fall, especially when these bass are starting to move up and they're chasing more bait fish. My favorite swim jig, I love these little Sabotage swim jigs that Blue Rock Custom Tackle makes. They're available there at Ohio River Outdoors. I keep it really simple when it comes to my swim jigs. I primarily throw three colors. I like black and blue. I like white and chartreuse and green pumpkin. When it comes to my trailers, I keep it accordingly. So if I'm throwing a black and blue, a lot of times I throw a black and blue trailer. Most of the time I throw a black and blue trailer. On this one here, I tried something a little different and had a green trailer. Whenever it comes to my chartreuse baits or my white and chartreuse ones, I typically throw a white or a chartreuse trailer. Whenever it comes to my green baits, I typically throw a green pumpkin trailer or something like that. One of my favorite baits to use are these little Strike King creature baits. I also like the grubs. I think that Mr. Twister baits work great as well, or even just a paddle tail swim bait. For a swim jig, I really like to have a heavier rod. I like a 7 foot to 7'4", medium heavy. I like a heavier line. Again, you're going to be throwing around a lot of cover and stuff like that. So the heavier your line is, the less likely you are to break off with those fish. Fluorocarbon, in my opinion, is the only way to go. Whenever it comes to the other two options, like a crankbait or a topwater bait, again, I use the polymer knot, just like I'd mentioned with all these tactics. I use a polymer knot. There's really no major adjustments that you're going to be able to make to a crankbait or to a popper, or even to one of these choppos, like I'd mentioned before in the video. I will say with the chopo, it is a good idea to put like a snap swivel or something on it to keep line twist out of it. But outside of picking your color selection, there's not a whole lot to go into with rigging these things up different ways outside of the knot that I prefer to use. I will say when it comes to color selection, in the fall, I go to a lot more of your natural colors like your greens or your browns, blacks and blues. This time of year, I do start to get away from like chartreuse colors, stuff like that. I will say that in some lakes, I have found the color white is an outstanding color in the fall. You really got to play around with that. A lot of that's going to depend on the lake that you're at, what kind of forage, what kind of feeder fish there are, bait fish there are, or what color the crawfish are. I will say this time of year, if you really pay attention, you'll notice that your crawfish, they do start to become a darker color just because of the water temperature cooling down. Some things will even start to become kind of a reddish color. A lot of those bright colors that you see in bait fish start to go away as the water temps cool down. So that's why I choose more natural colors. Final piece of advice I'm going to leave you all with is just get out on the water and go fishing. You're not going to do yourself any justice if you just sit here and watch these videos and you never actually go fish in the fall or fish whenever the water temps are cooler. I'll be the first to tell you that it wasn't that long ago that I was a very fair weather fisherman. I didn't like fishing in cold water because I didn't feel comfortable fishing in cold water. I didn't do good in cold water, and I wasn't used to it. Now, don't get me wrong, the 3 baits I just mentioned aren't the only baits that you can use. There's so many other good options this year, but I'm telling you, get out on the water, give those baits a try, especially if they're not something that you used before, because the only way you're ever going to become better is just to get out there and get on the water. I really hope you tune in next week. We'd love to have you all again. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you're hitting that like and subscribe button. We'll see y'all next time. Tight lines.